You have once again entered the world of survival horror. Good luck. This statement welcomes you back as you continue to explore the mansion estate as either Jill or Chris in Resident Evil 1. It's also a statement that can conveniently describe the distancing from the action aspects of modern Resident Evil and return to the series' survival horror roots with Resident Evil 7. Or so everyone is saying. It is true in many ways Resident Evil 7 is very reminiscent to classic Resident Evil, as it takes much of its inspiration from the older games, Resident Evil 1 in particular. But to analyze the survival horror elements in Resident Evil 7, one should also examine the aspects of classic Resident Evil that built the backbone of the series to begin with.
Welcome to the family, son.
Classic Resident Evil, that is Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, 0, Remake, and Code Veronica, has had an undeniable impact on survival horror, and in my opinion, still contains some of the best games in the genre. I would even say some of the defining elements of classic Resident Evil that may seem archaic by today's standards, such as the fixed camera angles, the tank controls, and the large amount of backtracking, still fit well into its survival horror mold. As the way I see it, in survival horror, player strengths have to be more or less balanced by player weaknesses, and the so-called dated parts of classic Resident Evil see to it there's a general feeling of uneasiness going in. The fixed camera angles mixed with the tight corridors and cramped rooms induce fears of claustrophobia and anxiety. More often than not, the camera is in a place where you don't have a direct line of sight on whatever is shuffling around the corner. Audio cues give you a hint on what is outside the camera's perspective, but it is harder to judge how far it is away or how many of them there might be. Auto-aim helps in taking down threats off camera, but resources are limited, so it's usually smarter to bypass whatever's in your way rather than engaging directly. However, that is easier said than done. Tank controls remove most immediate movement options, while the tight hallways restrict movement even further, so trying to leave the room without fighting is risky. And if you do manage to get past the thing blocking your path, chances are you're going to have to revisit that area multiple times as you progress through the loop of getting item A to place into slot B to obtain key C so you can unlock doors D, E, and F. Fighting is eventually inevitable, but it's your judgment to decide which undead should be dealt with and which are better left alone, as a mismanagement of ammo or healing items will put you in a tough spot and may unavoidably lead to your death. It's in this sense resources are given a high priority. Every cache of bullets, individual herb, or set of ink ribbons you find is very much like finding a small reward for surviving for so long, while coming across a new weapon should give you a moderate amount of assurance to face any upcoming horror. Not only is it an extra way to dispatch undead, but each new weapon feels like a significant upgrade when compared to the last. And nothing validates this statement more than when you find the shotgun, especially when it comes to the shotgun in Resident Evil 2. Going from taking down a zombie by using several shots from the handgun to decapitating a group of zombies with one well-timed blast by the shotgun is one of the most empowering things in classic Resident Evil. In Resident Evil 2 specifically, this feeling is compounded when later in the game you find shotgun parts to upgrade the shotgun into a weapon that can essentially erase a zombie's upper torso. It's satisfying from a visual standpoint, but it's made even more satisfying due to the game's amazing sound design. In fact, the sound design in Resident Evil as a whole is nothing short of astounding. Navigating the grim Spencer Mansion halls with the various ambient noises, the sound of your own footsteps, and the occasional groan of a zombie off in the distance really enforces the feeling of isolation. While seeking respite in a safe room and hearing the calm yet haunting safe room music lets you know this is a place of sanctuary, but only temporarily, as you will return to the horror once you leave. To put it simply, classic Resident Evil is smartly designed. It's smartly designed so all aspects work in conjunction to keep players constantly on edge, while also giving small rewards along the way to partially balance feelings of vulnerability. Satisfying to those who know how to manage their resources, yet unforgiving to those who are wasteful or unprepared. And it's memorable in a way most other games aren't. By my experience, Resident Evil Remake was the first classic Resident Evil game I finished. It is one of the few games where after I finished Jill's campaign, I immediately went back to play Chris's. The layout of the Spencer Mansion becomes so memorable so quickly that by the second playthrough I knew where most everything was because I had spent the vast majority of my first playthrough backtracking through rooms to search for resources or to unlock new sections that were previously inaccessible, all the while memorizing rooms where I had left zombies or other threats alone. The idiosyncratic design of the mansion, and by extension almost every other area in classic Resident Evil, gives each place a distinct charm so the eccentric puzzles and bizarre rooms stick with you. Although it does get a little ridiculous by the time you get to Resident Evil 3 because, fuck off, they designed parts of the city like this too. But hey, if you were to ask me, what best represents survival horror in Resident Evil? I would point to Resident Evil Remake and say, pretty much that. Where some of the later classic Resident Evil titles slightly de-emphasize survival horror to focus a bit more on action, with Code Veronica being an almost full descent into the nonsensical, Remake actually builds upon the oppressive horror atmosphere and strict resource availability of the original Resident Evil, without having the poor localization and overly cheesy tone to jar you out of the experience.
No! Don't go!
In Remake, zombies turn into faster, stronger Crimson Heads if their heads aren't destroyed or their bodies burned. So on top of managing ammo and healing items, you also have to keep track of kerosene levels too. The inclusion of an additional subplot details the morbid lengths Umbrella is willing to go for the sake of its own research, providing a terrifying monster related to the gruesome fate of the mansion's architect, George Trevor, and his family. Even something as minor as not having the dogs immediately break through the windows on the right first floor hallway for the purposes of shaking up players who are familiar with the original is one of the small reasons why Remake is one of the best Resident Evil games out there. It's a point in the series where the survival horror tone is clearly at its peak, and it's certainly a benchmark Resident Evil 7 draws its inspiration from. On that note, Resident Evil 7 does take the survival horror tone of classic Resident Evil and runs with it quite well. There's a constant sense of dread during your stay at the Baker family plantation, similar to the dread you feel going through any area in classic Resident Evil. The Baker household resembles a smaller scale dilapidated Spencer mansion if it were left in the hands of a hoarder. Everything from the layout of the property down to the puzzles used to close off rooms and guard valuable items seems to be directly influenced by the original Resident Evil. Dead animals adorn some of the doors as the eccentric keys of old are supplanted by keys that are just as eccentric, now with a macabre twist. While tape recorders replace the traditional typewriter as your method for saving, and on Madhouse difficulty, the save system is nearly identical to the save system in classic Resident Evil. But regardless of whether or not you're on Madhouse difficulty, resources are somewhat scarce again, except now since you can freely move the camera, they are more at liberty to effectively hide valuable items from you. I know Resident Evil 7 received a fair amount of skepticism for its change to first person, but the way it ultimately turned out, the change isn't so dramatic to make Resident Evil 7 feel like anything other than a classic-inspired Resident Evil game. Narrow hallways lead to small cluttered rooms which are difficult to move around in, enemies can easily ambush you from around corners if you aren't readily prepared, and scavenging for resources is particularly satisfying because of how well hidden some of the items are. Honestly, I think the addition of a blocking mechanic is a bigger change than the change to first person. Ethan's ability to block assumes you might get hit on a somewhat regular basis. Though there have been similar features in other Resident Evil games with the use of defensive items in Remake and the emergency dodge in Resident Evil 3, those are more precautionary measures you can take to circumvent damage rather than mitigate it. They aren't necessarily needed to avoid conflicts entirely, since once you can make it past something, you can usually outpace it. Given how slow Ethan is compared to how fast some of the enemies can attack, it is harder to passively avoid something without taking damage. I figure you can complete Resident Evil 7 without blocking because it's not impossible to make it past an enemy without getting hit, and you do have weapons to back you up, but unless you want to purposely limit yourself for whatever reason, you can only take a couple of hits before you die, so blocking seems almost vital in some cases. Trust me, you will need every tool at your disposal to survive the horrors of Resident Evil 7, and half of it is due to the presence of the Bakers. Jack and Marguerite Baker, for instance, will go out of their way to pursue you during your time at their residence, reminding me of the constant threat of Nemesis in Resident Evil 3. However, unlike the Nemesis encounters where Nemesis drops a good item for every separate occasion he is defeated, giving an incentive to fight the near indestructible monster at the cost of your own resources, the Bakers drop a hot pile of nothing if you decide to fight them. Avoiding them is preferable until you can eventually confront them in the no-holds-bars fight to the death, at one point featuring chainsaws, because this is a Resident Evil game, of course. I'm sure if there isn't some reference to a chainsaw or some other heavy industrialized equipment past Resident Evil 4, someone at Capcom gets fired. Anyway, as far as antagonists go, the Bakers give Resident Evil 7 a lot of its personality. I couldn't help liking the insane quartet of crazy Southerners despite them being the very reason for my distress. It seems Resident Evil hasn't had a good imposing villain since Albert Wesker ate it in a volcano at the end of Resident Evil 5, and the Bakers fill that void quite nicely, at least as far as Resident Evil 7 is concerned. So on the other side of the spectrum, the other main threat you'll face are the Molded, a horde of enemies which couldn't be less interesting if they tried. You know, one of the many things I think Resident Evil can pride itself on is its fantastic creature design. Yeah, you can poke fun at the myriad of large zombie animals, but at least Resident Evil made them feel unique. The Molded are basically black goo people. And that's it. Don't worry though, there are variations. Aside from your regular black goo person, you have the bladed black goo person, the crawling black goo person, and the tubby black goo person. They make sense within the context of how they are presented, and they are an effective enemy, which I guess in the end is all that really matters. But in a series where the variety of enemies are both effective threats and visually interesting, even if they are just a zombie animal, the enemies you confront in Resident Evil 7 are by far the weakest in the series. And that's coming from a place where Resident Evil 0 exists. It's a minor complaint, I know, but it consists of a larger reason why I had a bit of a falling out with Resident Evil 7. Of all the fun I had with RE7 because of its adherence to the tone and structure of classic Resident Evil, there was a point I can describe as taking a boat trip to the unfun part of the game. The interesting and quirky Baker household is followed up by a considerably less interesting wrecked ship, and then a subsequently dull mine. The oppressive horror atmosphere and interconnected level design is still there, sort of. The latter third of Resident Evil 7 becomes this weird mesh of the slow-paced horror of classic Resident Evil and the crazy nonsense action of modern Resident Evil, becoming increasingly more action-focused and linear as you go along. It's not necessarily bad, much of it is just uninteresting. There aren't any notable hyper-tense near endgame moments like in Remake where you have to transport a volatile fuel capsule that will explode if you do anything other than walk. And since Resident Evil 7 hasn't been building up the action angle, the action isn't as balls to the wall satisfying like near the end of Resident Evil 4 when you're facing off against a small army of Ganados while a helicopter provides supporting fire. The last third of Resident Evil 7 mostly involves confronting the same Molded you've encountered countless times before, while you navigate the bland hull of a wrecked ship and then the boring tunnels of a salt mine. I understand in a way it's supposed to represent the final build-up laboratory sequences of classic Resident Evil, but it goes on for far too long and a lot of it seems like filler so Resident Evil 7 can drop the plot hammer on you. Although no matter how many times Resident Evil 7 aggressively bludgeons you with its plot hammer, by the end of it there are more questions than answers. It is a bit rough, but at least the story does come together to resolve things with the Baker family, unless we're talking about Lucas, and despite the ending being the standard brand of ridiculous all Resident Evil endings are, Resident Evil 7 is ultimately tied in with the overarching universe in a way that's not too off the rails. I'm not gonna lie, I was a little worried as I was playing the teaser because when I saw the photo of the helicopter with the Umbrella logo on it, all the memories started coming back to me.
What a
Chris
mansion!
is our old
Stop it.
partner, you know.
Don't
Your
open
fire.
that door!
I'm a human.
This is
Considering
not
Umbrella
Chris's
caused all this in the
Where's
first
everyone
place,
going?
those
Too close.
liars.
Bingo?
You were almost a jerk.
See the president's equipped his daughter.
Running off like that was reckless and stupid.
Why are you doing this?
What do you accomplish by unleashing Ouroboros?
Every day, humans come one step closer to self-destruction. I'm not destroying the world, I'm saving it.
I have this.
By the end, Resident Evil 7 is a testament to classic Resident Evil. It adapts concepts such as inventory management, resource scarcity, interconnected level design, unorthodox puzzles, and horror ambiance to make it feel very familiar to classic Resident Evil, yet also a bit unique to itself. Although it might overstay its welcome by the time you get halfway through the wrecked ship section, Resident Evil 7 is a very good Resident Evil game. It gives me more hope for the future of one of my favorite franchises because it proves Resident Evil hasn't lost touch with a survival horror made famous by the classic games.